We were here back in 2016 when I did two similar type of talks along with others. And they have been so pivotal and so many people have watched them that we decided to revamp them but also upgrade them because, hi Sarah and John, because with this kind of material there is always new research that's going on and we've got to keep on top of it. One of the reasons another reason we're doing this is because it went so big on the internet. I think on KT there's about over 300,000 that have watched this talk that I did 3 years ago. So we need to make sure that we keep it up to scratch. So what we're going to do tonight is ask this first question. What really happened with Islam? The birth of it. Now you notice I'm putting what possibly happened. This is not going to be definitive. Next year, I'll be probably changing some of the things I'm saying tonight. Because of the fast-moving, the research that's going on, we need to keep on top of it. That's why I'm saying possibly to begin with. But let's go ahead and see what Muslims have claimed. And all Muslims claim really two things. First and foremost, that Muhammad has been the last and the greatest prophet. Now, Muslims would believe that Islam has always existed. Adam and Eve were Muslims. I don't believe that. Most of you don't believe that. But certainly Muslims would start from that premise. Secondly, they would say that Muhammad received revelations between 610 and 632, that 22-year period. And then he started the Khilafah in 624. Most people assume, therefore, 624 is when Islam began. That's not what Muslims say. But in order to understand Islam, you need to understand this man and the book that was revealed to him, the Quran. Therefore, Islam is the final religion based on Muhammad's life and sayings, the Sunnah, and on the Quran's teaching. So, really, it's a religion of one book and one man. As Christians, we would start from the same paradigm, would we not? We also believe that as Christians, we have an authority called the Bible, and that the Bible points to another man, a bigger man, Jesus Christ. So, as Islam is dependent on one book and one man, so are we dependent on another book and another man. Because of that, we probably understand them better than anybody else. And that's why it's important that we go to that book and that man. Now, I'm not going to do the book tonight. That will be tomorrow night. In some ways, what I'm going to do tomorrow night is a lot more controversial and a lot more explosive and in many ways a lot more exciting. So let's start with the man. Let's start with Muhammad. What we need to do, we want to investigate both the Quran and Muhammad and see if indeed the Muslims are correct. Let's, for this study, look at Muhammad and the emergence of his religion called Islam. When you have studied Muhammad, this is the classical account. This is the only account that you're ever told. This is the account that you get in your schools, in your colleges, on university campuses. Anywhere you have studied Islam, this is the account you get. So let's go through it real quickly. Every Muslim, everybody knows that Muhammad was born in 570, that he started receiving these revelations in the Hira cave in 610, and that from 610 to 622, he received the Meccan revelations, roughly speaking, the second half of the Quran. In 621, he was woken up in the middle of the night, told to get on the back of a winged horse called the Burak, and he flies up from Mecca up to Jerusalem, and at Jerusalem he then flies up the seven heavens and meets Allah. Tells him to pray 50 times a day. He then comes down 2 heavens to the 5th heaven where he meets Moses, who says there's too many prayers, see if you can bring it down. So he bounces back and forth between the 7th and the 5th heaven and brings the prayers for 50, 45, 30, 15, 10, down to 5 prayers. After which Moses says that's fine enough, and then he comes back down to Jerusalem and then returns to Mecca. That happens in 621. 622, he then moves from Mecca to Medina, known as the Hijrah, which means the Exodus, with possibly between 80 to 200 followers. It depends on which account you're going to read. And then from 622 to 632, he is receiving these Medinan revelation, which would be the first half of the Quran. In 630, he walks into Mecca, conquers it without firing a shot. 632, he dies suddenly like most people, but according to some traditions, he was poisoned. At that point, the Quran had not yet been written down. The Quran that we have in our hands today did not exist at that time. It was memorized by many of his companions. Parts of it were written on bone, stone. Some of it was written on pieces of bark, but it was not written in a codex form. So 632, he dies. Abu Bakr takes over for 2 years. He dies peacefully. Umar then takes over for another 10 years, and he is killed. From 634 to 644, Uthman, the third caliph, takes over as the caliph, and he lives for about another 12 years before he is killed. And then Ali, the adopted son of Muhammad, has the last 5 years, 656 to 661. That is the classical account. Has anybody heard any other account besides this? Now, I'm just giving you the bare bones. This is just the skeleton. But that's it. That's all we've ever been told. That's all you're ever going to hear. Now, here's the problem. Everything I've just told you about takes place in this red period, this red dotted era, okay? Well, a little bit more. I did add up until the time of the end of the, what they call the Rashidun period, the time of the rightly guided caliphs. But everything we're talking about happens here. Now, how many of you assume that what I've just told you is written down by people who were living in that time period? Or better yet, how many would you have wanted everything I've just told you to have been written down from that same time period? Probably all of you, right? Of course. You would hope that eyewitness people who had seen Muhammad, who had seen what he did, who had heard what he said, had written down while he was living. Correct? Like we have with Jesus Christ. Nothing that I have told you in the last 10 minutes comes from that red period at all. In fact, nothing that I have just told you comes from the same century that Muhammad lived in. It doesn't come until this era here. In fact, the first thing we have of any biography of Muhammad is this man here, Ibn Ishaq. He died in 765. Muhammad died in 632. 130 years later. But we don't have any of Ibn Ishaq's material. We are dependent on this man here, Ibn Hisham. This is the first man to write down what he said. What he didn't like, he just threw away, only retained what he wanted. And so the first time we hear of any biography that's written down on any extent form that we can look at today is Ibn Hisham. Look at the date, 833. Do your maths. That's 200 years after the fact. Now that's just the Siratu Rasulullah, which would be the biography of Muhammad. As far as the sayings of Muhammad, which are much greater, much more prolific, you need to go to this man over here, Al-Bukhari. He is the first to write down the hadith. That's the sayings of the Prophet. Look at his date, 870. That's 240 years later. Everything that comes after that, in fact, they all come after that. After Al-Bukhari comes Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, Tirmidhi. They all come after 870. So those are two of the genre of what we know as the Islamic traditions. If you want to go to a third genre, the tafsir, which would be the commentaries, you need to go to this man here, Al-Tabari. He died in 923. He is also the first to write what we call as the Tariq, which would be the histories. So anything that comes, that is written after by Tabari, like Baidawi, Zamakhshari, Suyuti, they all come after 923. Which means everything we know about Muhammad, everything we know about how Islam began, everything we know about how the Quran was put together, all that you have been told your whole life does not come from the period it happened over here. It all comes from this period here, 200 to 300 years later. Does that bother any of you? It should bother all of you. Because that suggests, or that doesn't just suggest, that means that everything we know about this man, about Islam, how it began, does not come from any eyewitnesses whatsoever. It comes from people who are writing hundreds of years later and hundreds of miles away. Now, there's the names right there. 765, Ibn Ishaq, we don't have it. No extant manuscript. Ibn Hisham, Al-Bukhari, Al-Tabari, those are the main, the primary beginners of each one of those. Let's look at Jesus Christ. Everything we know about Jesus Christ, did people actually write down what he did and what he said from the same time period he was living? No, not while he was living. How about right after? Yes. Look at the Sirah of Jesus, the biography of Jesus. Who wrote the biography of Jesus? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Am I correct? And 3 of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, wrote before 60 AD. Jesus died in 33 AD. So within 30 years, you already have 3 biographies. John would have been written later, about 90 AD. So within 60 years, you have 4 biographies about Jesus Christ, 2 of them by eyewitnesses who actually saw him do what he did. What about the hadith of Jesus, the sayings of Jesus? In your New Testament, in the gospel account, whenever it's red letter, that would be the sayings. Am I correct? So there's the hadith of Jesus written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Again, so within 30 to 60 years, all the hadith of Jesus have been written down. That means with us, what Jesus did and what he said were written down within 60 years of his death. 2 of them by eyewitnesses, and the other 2 got it from the eyewitnesses. What about the tafsir? Well, the tafsir, the commentaries, would be Paul's letters. And they would have been written within 16 to 20 years, well, or 25 years after Christ's death. Even earlier than the gospel accounts. In the Tahriq, the histories, the book of Acts, written by Luke, between 52 AD and 62 AD, so within 20 to 30 years, you have already the Tahriq. So all 3 genera of what we know as the Sirah of Jesus, the Hadith of Jesus, the sayings of Jesus, the commentaries on what Jesus did, and the history of the early church were written within 50 to 60 years. Compare that with Islam, who don't have anything for 200 years, and theirs all written down from 200 to 300 years. What that says to me is that if I wanted to know anything about Jesus Christ, and all I have is what Islam has, I would know nothing about him until the 3rd century. How would I defend him? How would any of us defend Jesus if it was that late? Thank God we don't have the same problem. Isn't it great to know? We know who he was, we know what he said, we know where he went, we know where he died. All this we can pretty much be assured of. And yet Islam has nothing before 833. How many for you, is this the first time you've heard this? So you're not taught this in your schools. No one gives you any dates. This is the big lie that we've never been told, and that's why we're doing this here at Kensington Temple. You need to know this. And Muslims, I know Muslims are going to be watching this. It's going to be put up on YouTube, and I'm talking to Muslims specifically. You've got to deal with this, because if this is the case, then I'd like to know how is it you can defend your prophet and how you can defend your religion. Now, the 21st century scholars, this is their criticism. Concerning these late dates, Humphrey says, Islam as we know it did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. Andrew Rippon in Leicester said the Quran probably was not revealed to one man in 22 years, but likely evolved over a period of 50 to 100 years. Therefore, the conclusion, according to Cook and Robinson, is that the history of Islam, at least from the time of the Caliph Abdul Malik, hold on to that name, going to talk quite a bit about that tonight, and before is a later fabrication. Now that's quite a mouthful right there. What they're saying is almost everything that you have heard, everything you saw on that classical account about Muhammad is a lie. It's a fabrication. How am I going to prove that? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first ask their questions. And these are legitimate questions. These are the same questions that were asked about our Bible back in the 1800s when they're in Tübingen in Germany. Wellhausen was saying, how do we know who Abraham was? How can we know who Moses is? No one was writing at that time. None of this is eyewitness account. Moses was not there when Abraham was living. Remember those questions? How do we even know that Moses wrote it? Remember the documentary hypothesis? All of this, redacted criticism, source criticism, all these criticisms that I'm going to be using tonight were first used on the Bible. And that's why I can use them tonight. Because those of us who've studied the Bible, this is our bread and butter. This is what we're used to. We know these kind of criticisms. You would not have historical criticism without biblical criticism. Everything I'm going to introduce tonight was created on the Bible. And the Bible has answered every one of those criticisms. That's why I can stand up here and show you what we're now going to ask. And these are the questions. Why in the world did it take so long to write down his biography? Why were people not writing it down as he lived? Muhammad's biography I'm talking about. Why did it take so long to write down what he said? Could people not read or write? Remember, they controlled, by 652, they controlled Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. Are you telling me nobody could read and write in those 5 cities?
کانالی مؤلف در حوزه نقد فرهنگ.